During 1992, 3D graphics were on the horizon and were being developed for home consoles. With the commercial success of the Sega Genesis, Sega was ready to springboard into the 3D world, hence the development of the Sega Saturn. The Sega Saturn is a home console developed by Sega, released in 1994 in Japan and in May 1995 in America. This was Sega's answer to the 5th generation home consoles and was the successor of the Sega Genesis. The Saturn has a dual CPU architecture and 8 processors. Most of the games for the Saturn are arcade ports and original games. The Saturn could be considered the most powerful console of the 5th generation. Development of the Sega Saturn began in 1992, along with Sega's groundbreaking 3D Model 1 arcade hardware debut. The Saturn was designed around the Hitachi Super H or SH2 chip. Sega added another video display processor in early 1994 to better compete with the Sony PlayStation. The Saturn was initially successful in Japan, but didn't perform equally in the United States. Mismanagement hindered the Saturn by an unexpected May 1995 launch, 4 months before its scheduled release date. After the debut of the Nintendo 64 in late 1996, the Saturn rapidly lost market share in the US and was discontinued in 1998. Having sold 9.62 million units worldwide, the Sega Saturn is considered a commercial failure. With the cancellation of Sonic Extreme, its planned first 3D Sonic game is considered a factor in its failure. The Dreamcast became Saturn's successor in 1998. The Sega Saturn is remembered for several A-list titles, including Nights into Dreams, the Panzer Dragoon series, and the Virtua Fighter series. Its reputation is mixed due to its complex hardware design and limited third-party support. Sega's management or lack thereof was criticized for its decisions during Sega Saturn's development and discontinuation. In the early 1990s, Sega had success with the Genesis, known as the Mega Drive worldwide, largely because of the aggressive advertising campaigns and the opportunity of its Sonic the Hedgehog series. Sega also had success with the arcade games. In 1992 and 1993, the Sega Model 1 arcade system board showcased Sega's AM2, Virtua Racing, and Virtua Fighter, which was the first 3D fighting game. This played a crucial role in the popularization of 3D polygonal graphics. The Model 1 was expensive, so several alternatives helped bring Sega's newest arcade games to Genesis, such as the Sega Virtual Processing Chip used for Virtua Racing and the 32X add-on. Development of the Saturn was supervised by Hideki Sato, Sega's director and general manager of research and development. According to the project manager Hideki Okamura, the project started over 2 years before the Saturn was showcased at the Tokyo Toy Show in June 1994. The codename Saturn was initially only during its development. In 1993, Sega and Hitachi formed a joint venture to develop a new CPU for the Saturn. What they created was the Super H RISC engine, or the SH2. The Saturn was designed around a dual SH2 configuration. Kazuhiro Hamada, Sega's section chief for Saturn development, chose the SH2 for its cost and efficiency. He realized that a single CPU was not enough to calculate a 3D world. Saturn's design was largely finished before the end of 1993. Reports in early 1994 of the technical capabilities of the Sony's up-and-coming PlayStation console promoted Sega to include another video display processor, VDP, to improve 2D performance and 3D texture mapping. Sega considered making CD-ROM based and cartridge-only versions of the Saturn, but discarded the idea due to concerns over lower quality and higher prices of cartridge games. According to Sega of America's president, Tom Kalinske, Sega of America fought against the architecture of the Saturn perpetually. Seeking an alternative graphics chip for the Sega Saturn, Kalinske attempted to broker a deal with Silicon Graphics, but Sega of Japan rejected the proposal. Silicon Graphics subsequently collaborated with Nintendo on the Nintendo 64. Galinsky, Sony Electronics Publishing Olaf Olafsson, and Sony of America's Mickey Shulov had discussions development of a joint Sega-Sony hardware system, which never came to fruition due to Sega's desire to create a hardware that could accommodate both 2D and 3D visuals, and Sony competing notions on focusing on 3D technology. Publicly, Galinsky defended the Saturn's design. Our people feel that they need the multi-processing to be able to bring to the home what we're doing next year in the arcades. In 1993, Sega changed its internal studios to prepare for the Saturn's launch. To ensure high-quality 3D games will be ready early in the Sega Saturn's life, a more energetic working environment was created by asking developers from Sega's arcade division to create console games. New teams such as the Panzer's Dragoon developers Team Andromeda were formed during this time. In early 1994, the Sega Titan video arcade system was announced as an arcade counterpart to the Saturn. In April 1994, Acclaim Entertainment announced it would be the first American publisher to produce software for the Titan. In January 1994, Sega began to develop an add-on for the Genesis, the 32X, to serve as a less expensive entry into the 32-bit era. The decision to create the add-on was made by Sega CEO Hayao Nakayama and widely supported by the Sega of America's employees. According to the former Sega of America Scott Bayless, Nakayama was worried that the Sega Saturn would not be available until after 1994 and that the recently released Atari Jaguar will reduce Sega's hardware sales. As a result, Nakayama ordered the engineers to have the system ready for launch by the end of the year. The 32X would not be compatible with the Saturn, but Sega's executive Richard Rudolph Linder pointed out that the 32X would play Genesis games and had the same architecture as the Saturn. This was justified by Sega's statement that both platforms would run at the same time, and that the 32X would be aimed at players who could not afford the more expensive Saturn. According to Sega of America's research and development head Joe Miller, the 32X served a role in assisting development teams to familiarize themselves with the dual SH2 architecture also used in the Saturn. Because the machines shared many parts and were being prepared to launch around the same time, tension emerged between Sega of America and Sega of Japan when the Saturn was given priority. This concludes Chapter 1 of the Sega Saturn history. Thank you for visiting CLOPIXEL Gamers. If you enjoyed this documentary, please like, share, comment, and subscribe, and we'll be seeing you in Chapter 2 of the Sega Saturn history.